30 days passed faster than Jisoo expected, each one filled with cooking and caring, and watching Vrix transform from a frightened, starving creature into something resembling a happy child. She documented everything with obsessive detail, taking medical scans every 3 days to show his improving health, recording videos of him playing and laughing and learning to help in the kitchen. Vrix had taken to cooking with remarkable enthusiasm, standing on a special stool Jisoo built for him so he could reach the counter, stirring pots and chopping vegetables with his small clawed hands. He was not very good at it yet, but he tried so hard that Jisoo found herself smiling constantly, even when he made messes that took an hour to clean. Word of their story had spread far beyond Meridian's rest, carried by travelers and merchants to stations and planets across the sector. And Jisoo received messages from thousands of strangers offering support and encouragement. Some sent credits to help with legal fees. Others sent supplies and equipment. And one elderly Veltari couple sent a tiny apron embroidered with flames that Vrix wore every day while cooking. The restaurant had never been busier, with customers coming from across the station to eat meals prepared by the human who had challenged the Dracani. And many of them brought their children to meet the little dragon who had become famous. Vrix was shy at first, hiding behind Jisoo's legs when strangers approached. But gradually, he learned that most people meant him no harm, and some even wanted to be his friend. On the 28th day, something unexpected happened. A young Dracani female named Sereth came to the restaurant alone. Her scales a beautiful deep crimson and her eyes filled with uncertainty. She asked to speak with Jisoo privately, and when they sat together in the back room, she explained that she was a junior medic assigned to the delegation, and she had a confession to make. "I knew about the hatchling's condition," Sereth said quietly. "I knew he could not process Dragstone, and I recommended alternative nutrition, but Ambassador Korvax overruled me. He said it would be a sign of weakness to accommodate defective individuals." Jisoo listened without interrupting. "I should have fought harder," Sereth continued. "I should have done something instead of staying silent while a child starved. But I was afraid of what the ambassador would do to my career." "Why are you telling me this now?" Jisoo asked. Sereth met her eyes. "Because tomorrow is the final hearing and I want to testify. I want to tell the truth about what happened and why, even if it destroys me." Jisoo reached out and took the young Dracani's hand. "That is very brave of you." "No," Sereth replied. "What you did was brave. I am just trying to fix the wrong I helped create." The final hearing drew an even larger crowd than the first, with representatives from dozens of species packed into every available seat and hundreds more watching via station broadcasts. Administrator Chun called the proceedings to order and asked Jisoo to present her evidence of adequate care. The medical scans told a story that needed no explanation, showing Vrix's weight gain and scale regeneration and overall health improvement in clear visual terms. "He has gained 40% of his body mass," Jisoo explained. "His scales have regained their proper coloration, and his energy levels are appropriate for a hatchling his age. More importantly, his psychological state has improved dramatically." She played videos of Vrix laughing while cooking, playing with children of other species, and sleeping peacefully without nightmares for the first time in his life. Ambassador Korvax attempted to object multiple times, but Administrator Chen overruled him and allowed Jisoo to complete her presentation. Then Sereth stood and asked permission to testify. Korvax's scales flushed, dark with fury, as the young medic described how she had recommended alternative nutrition and been denied, how she had watched Vrix deteriorate for weeks without being allowed to help, how the delegation had knowingly let a child suffer because treating his condition would have been seen as accommodating weakness. When she finished, several other Dracani from the delegation rose and quietly moved to stand beside her. They were younger crew members mostly, technicians and assistants who had disagreed with traditional practices but never dared speak up. and their silent rebellion said more than words ever could, Administrator. Chen studied the evidence and the testimony for a long moment before rendering her verdict. It is clear to me that Chef Park Jisoo has provided excellent care for the hatchling Rix, she said. And it is equally clear that returning him to the Dracani delegation would put him at risk of continued harm. Therefore, I am granting permanent custody to Chef Park Jisoo under Article 7 of the Galactic Compact. The chamber erupted in cheers from supporters, while Ambassador Korvax stood frozen with rage as the celebration continued around her. Jisoo felt a tug at her sleeve and looked down to see Rix holding something in his hands. It was a small container of food. Vegetables roasted exactly the way she had taught him, arranged carefully on a plate with obvious love and attention. I made this for Ambassador Korvax, Rix said softly, because you taught me that food can make enemies into friends. Can I give it to him? Jisoo felt her heart swell with pride, and she nodded. Of course you can. Rix walked across the chamber floor toward the ambassador who had wanted to let him die. And every person in the room fell silent to watch. He stopped before Korvax and held up his offering. I am sorry that my condition brought shame to our people, but I hope this food shows you that humans are not our enemies. And maybe someday neither are children like me. Korvax stared down at the small dragon, holding a plate of human-prepared food. And something shifted behind his ancient eyes. He did not take the food, but he did not strike it away either. And after a long moment, he simply turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. It was not forgiveness, but it was not violence either, and Jisoo counted that as a victory months later. Homefire Kitchen had a new sign above the door that read, "All species welcome," in a dozen languages. And in the kitchen, a young dragon in a flame-embroidered apron stood beside his human mother, learning to cook meals that brought people together from across the galaxy. Sometimes travelers would ask how a human and a dragon became a family, and Rix would smile and tell them the story of how he carried vegetables to a chef's door, begging for something he did not even have words for. He had been begging for food. Yes, but also for kindness and safety and love, and somehow, impossibly, he had found all of it in a small restaurant on a forgotten station, because humans were strange creatures who looked at broken things and saw potential, who looked at enemies and saw friends, who looked at a starving dragon child and saw their own. That was the human way, and Rix was proud to be part of it. The hearing chamber was the largest room on Meridian's Rest, a circular space with tiered seating that could hold representatives from 100 different species. Today it held only a few dozen, but their attention was fixed on the two figures standing before the administrator's podium. The human chef in her simple clothes and the Dracani ambassador in his ceremonial armor. Administrator Chen Menghu was a tired woman in her 60s who had spent 30 years settling disputes between species, who could barely stand to breathe the same air. And she looked at the documents before her with the expression of someone who wished she had retired last year. Let me understand this correctly, she said. Chef Park Jisoo, you are claiming protective custody of the Dracani hatchling designated Rix under Article 7 of the Galactic Compact. I am, Jisoo replied, her voice steady. The Dracani ambassador Korvax slammed his clawed fist against the railing before him, making several nearby spectators jump in their seats. This is an outrage, he roared. This human has stolen a child of our noble species, and now she claims legal protection for her crime. I demand immediate return of the hatchling and severe punishment for this kidnapper. Administrator Chen raised one hand for silence. Ambassador, you will have your opportunity to speak, but I must follow proper procedure. She turned to Jisoo. Chef Park, Article 7 requires evidence of abuse or neglect before protective custody can be granted. Do you have such evidence? Jisoo stepped forward and activated a holographic display. showing medical scans she had obtained with help from Taeyeon and a sympathetic doctor on the station. These scans show severe malnutrition, consistent with weeks of starvation, she said. And these images show wounds inflicted by deliberate violence. Wounds that were present when Rix came to me 6 days ago after being beaten by his caretaker. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and Ambassador Korvax's scales flushed a deeper shade of copper. The hatchling is defective, he said dismissively. He cannot properly process our traditional foods. This is a genetic flaw, not abuse. Then why was he beaten for seeking food elsewhere? Jisoo asked. Why was he struck across the face and called worthless by the adult responsible for his care? Discipline is not abuse, Korvax replied. Our methods may seem harsh to soft human sensibilities, but they produce strong warriors. Strong warriors, Jisoo repeated, and her voice was cold. Look at him. She gestured to where Rix sat in a small chair beside Taeyeon. His scales still showing the marks of his beating, his body still thin despite a week of proper meals. Does this child look like he was being shaped into a strong warrior? Jisoo continued. Or does he look like he was being left to die? The chamber fell silent. Administrator Chan studied the medical evidence for a long moment before speaking. The scans do show severe malnutrition and signs of physical trauma. However, the question of cultural discipline practices is complex. There is nothing complex about a child who is starving to death, Jisoo said. Rix has a medical condition that prevents him from eating your traditional food. Instead of finding an alternative, his caretakers let him starve and beat him when he tried to feed himself. That is not culture. That is cruelty. Ambassador Korvax stepped forward, his massive form towering over Jisoo. You understand nothing of our ways. Human, weakness must be purged from our bloodlines. If this hatchling cannot survive on proper Dracani food, then he was never meant to survive at all. Then you admit you were letting him die on purpose. Jisoo asked. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, and Korvax realized his mistake too late. Administrator Chun banged her gavel for order. Ambassador Korvax, are you stating that the Dracani delegation intentionally withheld appropriate care from this child? Korvax straightened his posture and tried to recover. I am stating that our species has traditions that have served us for 10,000 years. Traditions that humans with their soft hearts and weak constitutions cannot understand. I understand perfectly, Jisoo replied. I understand that you looked at a sick child and decided he was not worth saving. I understand that your traditions told you it was better to let him starve than to adapt your methods. I understand that when he found the courage to seek help, you beat him for it. She paused and looked around the chamber at the representatives of a dozen different species. And I understand that. I will never let you take him back, Administrator. Chun called for a brief recess, and the chamber emptied slowly, with many spectators casting sympathetic looks toward Jisoo and hostile glances at the Dracani delegation during the break. Rix was brought forward to answer questions, and a translation device was fitted to his collar so everyone could understand his words. Rix. Administrator Chen asked gently, do you understand what is happening here today? Yes, Rix replied, his small voice amplified through the speakers. The human Jisoo wants to keep me safe, and Ambassador Korvax wants to take me back. And what do you want? Rix looked at Ambassador Korvax for a long moment, and everyone could see the fear in his eyes. But then he looked at Jisoo, and the fear transformed into something else. He climbed down from his chair and walked across the chamber floor, his small feet tapping against the metal, and he stopped beside Jisoo and reached up to take her hand in his tiny clawed grip. I want to stay with her, he said. She feeds me, and she does not hit me, and she looks at me like I matter. I never knew what that felt like before. Jisoo squeezed his hand and blinked back tears. Administrator Chen was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. I am prepared to render a preliminary ruling, Given the evidence of medical neglect and physical abuse, I am granting Chef Park Jisoo temporary custody of the hatchling. Rix for a period of 30 standard days. Korvax roared in protest, but Chung continued over his objections. During this period, Chef Park must demonstrate that she can provide adequate care for a Drakaani child. At the end of 30 days we will reconvene, and I will make a final determination. Until then, the hatchling will remain with his temporary guardian. She banged her gavel and the hearing was adjourned as Jisoo led Rix out of the chamber. Ambassador Korvax stepped into her path and leaned down until his face was inches from hers. You have made a powerful enemy today. Human, he said quietly. The Dracanae do not forget insults, and we do not forgive those who steal our young. Jisoo met his gaze without flinching. I have faced worse than you, Ambassador, and I am still standing. She walked past him with Rix's hand still in hers, and she did not look back, but she knew the battle was far from over. 5 days had passed since Rix first knocked on the back door of Homefire Kitchen, and he had returned every night without fail. He could not stay away because Jisoo's food was the only thing keeping him alive, and also because her kitchen had become the only place in the entire galaxy where he felt safe. Each night, he brought something new as payment. A shiny rock he found in a drainage grate, a colorful feather that had fallen from a Velthari merchant. Station tokens he discovered under a bench where someone had dropped them. Jisoo accepted each payment with the same serious respect, examining his offerings carefully before nodding and placing them in a small box she kept on a shelf above her. Spices Rix did not know that the box was filling with worthless trinkets that Jisoo treasured more than credits, because they represented a child's desperate attempt to maintain dignity in the face of starvation during the day. Rix returned to the Drakaani quarters and pretended to eat the official meals while secretly disposing of the food when no one watched. And the mineral supplement that poisoned his system stayed out of his body while Jisoo's cooking rebuilt his strength. His scales were already beginning to shine again, just a little, and he could walk without his legs trembling. But Goreth, his caretaker, was growing suspicious. The old warrior had noticed that Rix seemed healthier despite eating barely anything at meals, and he watched the hatchling with narrow eyes that missed nothing. Jisoo, meanwhile, had thrown herself into research, spending her free hours reading everything she could find about Drakaani, biology and nutrition on the station's information networks. She learned that the mineral supplement called Dragstone was essential for adult Drakaani warriors, but that rare individuals were born with an intolerance to it, and these individuals were considered defective and often died young because no one bothered to find alternative nutrition for them. The information made Jisoo so angry that she had to step outside and breathe deeply before she could continue reading. She began adapting her recipes specifically for Rix, finding plant-based sources of the minerals he needed without the compound that made him sick. And each night she watched him grow a little stronger. Word began to spread across the station. A Korthan merchant mentioned to a Velthari trader that she had seen small dragons sneaking into the human restaurant after dark, and the Velthari mentioned it to a Silaxian dock worker. And soon half the station was whispering about the human chef and her secret dragon visitor. Most species found it amusing or strange, but no one reported it to the Drakaani because most species disliked the arrogant reptiles anyway. On the 6th night, Jisoo received a visitor she had not expected. Kwan Taein was a station security officer and an old friend from Jisoo's military days, and he sat at her counter with a serious expression while she closed up the kitchen. You are playing a dangerous game, Jisoo, he said quietly. The Drakaani ambassador has heard the rumors, and he is furious. He believes someone on the station is harboring one of their young, and he is demanding an investigation. Jisoo continued wiping down her counter without looking up. I am just a cook, Taeyeon. I do not play games. Do not lie to me, Taeyeon said. I know you better than that, and I know that look in your eyes. It is the same look you had when you refused to leave the refugee camp on Tellus 4, even when the bombardment started. Jisoo stopped wiping and met his eyes. What would you have me do? Send a starving child back to people who are letting him die through neglect? Taeyeon sighed and rubbed his temples. I would have you be careful. The Draconi are powerful, and their ambassador has connections throughout the Galactic Council. If they discover you are harboring one of their citizens, they could make your life very difficult. My life has been difficult before, Jisoo replied. I survived. Taeyeon stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. Just be careful, old friend. I do not want to attend your funeral. He left without another word. And Jisoo stood alone in her kitchen, wondering if she was doing the right thing. An hour later, Rix did not come. Jisoo waited by the back door until well past midnight. And with each passing minute, her worry grew heavier in her chest. Finally, she heard a scratching at the door, weak and unsteady. And she threw it open to find Rix collapsed on the ground outside. His scales were torn in several places and dark. Blue blood seeped from cuts on his face and arms. And he looked up at her with eyes full of pain and fear. Who did this to you? Jisoo whispered, gathering him gently into her arms. Rix could not answer in words, but he made a keening sound and pressed himself against her chest. And Jisoo carried him inside with murder in her heart. She cleaned his wounds with supplies from her first aid kit. And the cuts were not deep, but they would scar. And she knew that someone had beaten this child with deliberate cruelty as she worked. Rix managed to communicate through gestures what had happened. Garath had followed him from the quarters and caught him sneaking toward the market district. And the old warrior had dragged him back and beaten him for bringing shame upon their species by associating with humans. Rix showed her how. Garath had struck him across the face and called him worthless and defective and better off dead. And Jisoo had to set down her medical supplies because her hands were shaking with rage. She had seen evil in many forms during the war, but cruelty toward children was something she could never accept or forgive. You are not going back there, Jisoo said firmly, cradling his small face in her hands. Do you understand me, Rix? You are never going back to people who hurt you. Rix looked at her with desperate hope in his eyes, as if he wanted to believe her, but could not imagine such a thing being possible. Jisoo stood and walked to her communication terminal and began composing a message to the station administrator. She was filing for emergency protective custody under Article 7 of the Galactic Compact, a law that allowed any citizen to claim guardianship of a minor who was being abused regardless of species. It was a long shot, and it would bring the full fury of the Draconi delegation down upon her head. But Jisoo had never been one to back down from a fight. She looked over at Rix, who had fallen asleep on her cot, exhausted from pain and fear. And she made herself a promise, whatever it took, however long it took. She would protect this child, because that was what humans did. They fought for the people they loved, even when the odds were impossible, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to. Jisoo had started to love this small dragon, who brought her vegetables and looked at her like she was the entire universe. She sent the message and waited for the storm to come. Jisoo guided the small dragon to a stool near her cooking station and watched as he climbed up with difficulty because his legs were shaking so badly from weakness and fear. She had seen malnourished children before, during the war, when she served meals to refugees fleeing destroyed colonies. And she recognized the signs in this little creature, even though his biology was completely different from her own. His scales should have been bright and shiny, but instead they were dull like old coins left in the rain. And his movements were slow and careful, like he was saving every bit of energy for survival. First things first, Jisoo said to herself as she moved to her refrigeration unit and pulled out fresh vegetables and some simple grains. She did not know what Drakaani could eat safely, but she knew that most carbon-based life forms could handle basic plant matter. So she decided to start simple and watch his reactions carefully. Rick sat on the stool and watched the human work with wide eyes, and he marveled at how fast her hands moved as she chopped and stirred and seasoned back home on the Drakaani homeworld. Food preparation was considered low work done by servant classes, and warriors like his family never touched cooking implements, but this human moved like cooking was a form of combat. Precise and focused and deadly serious. The smells rising from her pan made Rick's whimper softly, and he pressed his claws against his stomach to quiet it, growling because he did not want to seem rude or desperate, even though he was both. Jisoo heard the small sound, and her heart ached with a pain she had not felt in years. She finished quickly, plating a small portion of roasted vegetables with a mild grain porridge. Nothing fancy, but warm and nourishing and free of any spices that might upset an unfamiliar digestive system. She placed the plate before Rick's and stepped back to give him space. Rick stared at the food and then looked up at her with confusion in his eyes. And Jisoo realized he was waiting for permission, because Drakaani children probably had strict rules about when and how they could eat. "Go ahead," she said gently, miming the action of eating. "It is for you." All of it. Rix picked up a piece of roasted tuber with trembling claws and brought it to his mouth. And the moment the food touched his tongue, something inside him broke open. The vegetable was soft and warm and tasted like nothing he had ever experienced before. Rich and earthy and completely free of the mineral supplement that made him sick. He ate another piece and then another. And soon he was shoveling food into his mouth with abandon while tears streamed down his scaled face. Jisoo watched and said nothing because some moments were too sacred for words. When the plate was empty, Rick sat back and looked at her with an expression of pure gratitude. And then he did something that surprised them both. He pushed the wilted vegetables he had brought toward her, the same ones she had set aside when he entered. And he made a series of chirping sounds that clearly meant he was trying to pay for his meal. Jisoo looked at the sad little pile of half-rotten produce, and she understood what he was doing. And she felt her eyes grow wet because this child had nothing, but he still wanted to give what little he had. "These are perfect," she said, picking up the vegetables and examining them as if they were precious gems. "I will use these tomorrow to make a wonderful soup. You have paid your debt in full." Rix did not understand her words, but he understood that she accepted his payment. And he puffed up his small chest with pride because he had completed a fair transaction like a proper Drakaani. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, and Jisoo began to ask simple questions using gestures and pointing. And slowly she learned bits of his story. He pointed to himself and made a sound like Rix, so she learned his name. He pointed to his stomach and then to the food and made a sick face. So she understood that something about his normal meals made him ill. He pointed toward the direction of the Drakaani quarters and then wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. So she understood that he was afraid to go back. Jisoo was still piecing together this information when she heard heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. And the rhythmic clang of Drakaani armor was unmistakable. Rix heard it too, and his eyes went wide with terror. And he looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. Jisoo moved fast, grabbing Rix and carrying him to her supply closet in the back of the kitchen. And she set him down among bags of rice and flour and dried herbs. "Stay quiet," she whispered, pressing a finger to her lips. "Do not make a sound. I will keep you safe." Rix nodded and curled into a tiny ball. And Jisoo closed the closet door just as someone pounded on her front entrance. She smoothed her apron and walked calmly to the door and opened it to find two Drakaani guards towering over her, their copper scales gleaming under the station lights. Human, one of them growled. "We search for a hatchling who has gone missing from our delegation. Have you seen such a creature?" Jisoo looked up at them without flinching because she had faced worse than angry lizards in her lifetime. And she shook her head slowly. "I have been cleaning my kitchen alone all evening," she said. "I have seen no one. Perhaps your hatchling is hiding somewhere in the market stalls." Children do love to explore. The guards exchanged looks and then pushed past her into the restaurant. And they searched between tables and behind the counter while Jisoo watched with her arms crossed. One of them approached the kitchen area and Jisoo felt her heart stop. But the guard only glanced around before turning away with a grunt of disgust. "Filthy human cooking smells," he muttered. No Drakahani would hide in such a place. They left without another word. And Jisoo waited until their footsteps faded completely before she rushed to the closet and opened the door. Rix looked up at her from his hiding spot among the rice bags. And the trust in his eyes was so complete that Jisoo felt something shift in her chest. She did not know what she was going to do about this situation. But she knew one thing for certain. She would not let anyone hurt this child again. "You will stay here tonight," she said softly, lifting him from the closet and carrying him to a small cot in her back room where she sometimes napped between shifts. "Tomorrow we will figure out what to do. But tonight you will sleep with a full belly and a warm blanket." Rix curled up on the cot and closed his eyes. And within moments, he was asleep with a peaceful expression on his face. Jisoo watched him for a long time. This small dragon who had carried vegetables to her door like they were treasure. And she wondered how she had gotten herself into this mess. But deep down, she knew she would make the same choice 1,000 times over. Because some things mattered more than safety, and kindness was one of them. The smell of roasting garlic drifted through the narrow corridors of Meridian's Rest, a galactic way station where dozens of species lived and traded and argued over prices that never seemed fair to anyone. Park Jisoo wiped her hands on her apron and checked the pot of stew bubbling on her stove. And she smiled because it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen back on Earth. A place she had not seen in 15 years. Her restaurant was small. Just 8 tables crammed into a space meant for 4. But travelers came from across the station to eat her food because she cooked with something most species did not understand. She cooked with love. The dinner rush had ended an hour ago. And Jisoo was cleaning her kitchen when she heard the commotion outside her window. And she looked up to see a procession of Drakahani warriors marching through the market district. The Drakahani were tall reptilian creatures covered in scales that shimmered like polished copper. And they walked with their heads held high because their species believed they were superior to all others in the galaxy. Jisoo had served in the Terran expansion wars as a military cook. And she had seen Drakahani soldiers tear through human battalions without mercy. So she understood why the other merchants closed their shutters and hid. But Jisoo did not hide because she had learned long ago that fear was a luxury she could not afford. She watched the delegation pass, counting 12 adults and 3 young ones trailing behind. And one of the young ones caught her attention because it was so much smaller than the others. This little dragon was barely the size of a house cat, with scales that should have been bright orange but instead looked dull and faded. And its eyes darted around with a hunger that Jisoo recognized instantly. She had seen that look in refugee camps during the war, in the eyes of children who had not eaten in days. The small dragon noticed her, watching, and their eyes met for just a moment before an adult Drakahani barked a command, and the little one hurried to catch up with the group. Jisoo returned to her cleaning, but she could not forget those hungry eyes 3 corridors away. The small dragon, named Rix, followed his caretaker through the station, and his stomach ached with an emptiness that never went away no matter how much he ate at the official meals. The problem was the mineral supplement that all Drakani consumed with their food. a substance that strengthened scales and bones and made warriors powerful. But whenever Rix ate it, his body rejected it violently. He had tried to tell his caretaker Gorath about his sickness, but Gorath had slapped him across the snout and called him weak and defective. Because admitting physical problems was forbidden in Dracani culture, a true Dracani endured all pain in silence. So Rix stayed silent and starved slowly while pretending to eat meals that made him vomit in secret. And each day he grew weaker while the adults around him grew stronger that night. After the delegation settled into their quarters, Rix lay on his sleeping mat and listened to his stomach growl. And he thought about the human female he had seen through the window. He had smelled something coming from her building, something warm and rich that made his mouth water, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than despair. He felt hope. Rix waited until Gorath began snoring, and then he crept out of the room on silent feet, moving through shadows the way small prey animals learn to move when predators were near. The station corridors were mostly empty at this hour, lit by soft blue lights that made everything look like it was underwater. And Rix followed his nose toward the smell that had captured his attention. He passed merchants packing up their stalls for the night, and one of them, a four-armed Korthan, was throwing away vegetables that had gone slightly soft. Rix watched from behind a support beam as the Korthan tossed purple tubers and green leafy things into a waste bin. And when the merchant left, Rix darted forward and gathered as many vegetables as his small arms could carry. He did not know why he was collecting them, only that something in his instincts told him he should not approach the human empty-handed. The walk to the restaurant took longer than expected because Rix had to hide twice when station security patrols passed by. But finally he stood at the back door of a place with a sign that read Home Fire Kitchen in multiple languages. Through the window, he could see the human female still working in her kitchen, and the smells coming from inside made his legs tremble with one. Rix looked down at the vegetables in his arms, wilted and bruised and probably worthless, and he felt shame burn through his chest because what kind of offering was this? But his hunger was stronger than his shame. He approached the door and raised one small clawed hand and knocked 3 times. And then he waited with his heart pounding so hard he thought they might burst inside. Jizu heard the knock and frowned because no one came to her back door at this hour. And she grabbed a kitchen knife before approaching, because old habits from the war never truly died. She opened the door and looked down, and her breath caught in her throat. The small dragon from the procession stood before her, holding a bundle of half-rotten vegetables against its chest, and its eyes were wet with something that looked very much like tears. It made a sound, a high keening noise that needed no translation because hunger and desperation sounded the same in every language across the galaxy. Jisu had served in wars and seen horrors that still visited her in nightmares. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, for a child of her former enemy standing at her door and begging for food. She thought about the diplomatic complications and the angry Drakahani warriors and the trouble this could bring to her quiet life. And then she thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that a hungry child was never an enemy. Jisu put down her knife and knelt, so she was at eye level with the little dragon. And she spoke softly, even though she knew he probably could not understand her words. "You are hungry, little one," she said, and she took the vegetables from his arms gently. "These are a fine payment for a meal. Come inside and let me feed you." Rix did not understand her language, but he understood her tone and her open door and her lack of weapons. And for the first time in his short life, he walked toward kindness instead of away from it. He stepped into the warmth of her kitchen, and the door closed behind him. And neither of them knew that this single moment would change everything. But the galaxy has a way of turning on small hinges. And sometimes the biggest revolutions begin with the smallest acts of mercy.